moment my boss raised his glass at my retirement party, I thought he was about to thank me for 30 years of loyalty, but instead he smiled and said something that made the entire room go quiet, and in that silence I realized my life was not ending the way I believed it would. My name is Margaret Collins, I'm 67 years old, and until that night I believed the hardest part of my life was already behind me. The banquet room at the Lakeside Conference Center looked beautiful that evening, the kind of place with tall windows overlooking Lake Erie and soft golden lights hanging from the ceiling. My coworkers had decorated the tables with blue and silver balloons, and someone even brought a cake that said, "Happy Retirement, Margaret." I remember standing there holding a glass of sparkling cider, looking around at the people I had worked beside for nearly 3 decades, thinking how strange it felt that tomorrow morning I wouldn't be driving the familiar 12 miles from my little house in Toledo to the logistics office where I had spent most of my adult life. For 30 years I showed up before 8 every morning, rain or shine, through Ohio winters that buried the streets in snow and summer so humid the air felt thick. I raised my son Daniel while working that job, balancing overtime shifts and school meetings, making sure the lights stayed on and there was always food on the table. That night was supposed to be a celebration of all those years. My coworkers laughed, clinked glasses, and told stories about old projects and impossible deadlines we somehow survived together. I even spotted Linda Parker, my closest friend at the office, wiping a tear when she hugged me and said she couldn't imagine the department without me. For a while, everything felt warm and genuine, the way retirement parties are supposed to feel. My son Daniel was there too, standing near the back of the room with his wife Rachel. I remember feeling proud seeing him there, tall and confident at 38, wearing a dark blazer and talking with a few of my colleagues. When he was little I used to sit at the kitchen table late at night helping him with homework after working a 10-hour shift, telling him that someday all the hard work would pay off. And that night, watching him smile politely at the people who had become my second family, I thought maybe it had. Then my boss, Mr. Harrison, tapped his glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. Conversations faded, chairs turned toward the front of the room, and he stepped forward with the relaxed grin he always wore during company events. "Margaret," he said, raising his glass slightly, 30 years is a long time to dedicate to one company." People nodded, some clapped softly, and I felt my cheeks warm with quiet pride. I expected him to talk about loyalty, maybe tell a funny story from the early days when everything was still done on paper instead of computers. Instead, he looked around the room with that same easy smile and added, "You know, you should really thank your son for tonight." At first I thought I misunderstood him. Maybe he meant Daniel helped organize the party. But Mr. Harrison chuckled lightly and said the words that made the air feel suddenly heavy in my chest. "He's the one who came to us and asked that we let you go so you could finally retire." For a moment nobody spoke. The music from the corner speakers kept playing softly, but every face in the room seemed frozen between confusion and discomfort. I turned slowly toward the back of the room where Daniel had been standing just seconds before, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just heard, because in that quiet moment I realized something was terribly wrong. For several seconds I simply stood there holding my glass while the words echoed in my head, because what my boss had just said did not make sense to me at all. I felt dozens of eyes in the room shifting quietly between me and the empty space where my son had been standing only moments earlier. My heart was beating faster than it had all evening, yet my body felt strangely still, like my mind had not caught up with the moment yet. I forced a small smile, the kind people use when they are unsure if something is meant to be a joke. "I am sorry," I said gently, looking toward Mr. Harrison. "What did you mean by that?" He seemed slightly surprised by my question, as if he assumed I already understood. He took a small sip from his glass and shrugged in a casual way. "Oh, I just meant Daniel reached out to us a while back," he said. "He said you had worked hard your entire life and deserved to rest. He thought maybe it was time you finally enjoyed retirement." A few people in the room shifted in their chairs. Someone near the back cleared their throat. The music from the speakers continued playing a slow jazz song, but now it sounded distant, almost like it was coming from another building. I turned again toward the place where Daniel had been standing, expecting to see him step forward and explain what was going on, but he was no longer there. His wife Rachel was gone too. The spot near the back wall where they had been talking only minutes earlier was now empty except for a chair pushed slightly away from the table. A strange uneasiness crept into my chest. My son had told me he was proud of me for reaching retirement. Just 2 weeks earlier he called to ask what day the party would be held so he could make sure he attended. Nothing about his voice during that conversation suggested he had already spoken to my company about ending my career early. I looked back at Mr. Harrison, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "Daniel asked you to fire me?" I said slowly, making sure I had heard the words correctly. Mr. Harrison gave a small laugh, as if the distinction was not important. "Well, technically he suggested we encourage you to retire sooner rather than later. He said you might not make the decision yourself because you are the responsible type." That sentence landed heavier than the first one. Encourage you to retire sooner. Suddenly the meeting I had been called into 3 weeks earlier replayed clearly in my mind. The human resources manager had sat across from me with a folder on the table and explained that the company was restructuring and that my position would be phased out at the end of the month. At the time I accepted the explanation without questioning it because after 30 years I assumed the company simply needed younger employees with different technical skills. Now I felt a quiet chill moving through me as I realized the timeline did not feel like a coincidence anymore. I glanced again toward the door of the banquet room, half expecting Daniel to walk back in and tell everyone this was some kind of misunderstanding, but the door remained closed. Conversations around the tables slowly began again, though softer now, more cautious. People avoided looking directly at me. In that moment I realized something else that made my stomach tighten, even more than my boss's words. Judging by the uncomfortable expressions around the room, it seemed very possible that everyone here had known about this conversation long before I did. I stood there for another moment listening to the low murmur of voices returning around the room, but my thoughts had already drifted somewhere far from that banquet hall beside Lake Erie. When something does not make sense in the present, the mind has a strange way of searching the past for answers, and suddenly memories of Daniel began replaying in my head one by one. I remembered the tiny apartment where we lived when he was a little boy, just the two of us after his father passed away when Daniel was only 7 years old. The place was small, barely 800 square feet, with a kitchen window that looked out over a parking lot, but I always tried to make it feel like home. I worked long shifts at the logistics company even back then, sometimes leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. Yet every evening I still sat at the kitchen table with Daniel, helping him finish his homework while dinner cooled on the stove. On weekends we would drive 20 minutes to the public park near the Maumee River where he rode his bicycle while I watched from a wooden bench with a cup of coffee in my hands. I promised myself during those years that my son would grow up with opportunities one never had. That promise was the reason I stayed with the same company for 3 decades, working overtime whenever it was offered, and putting every extra dollar I could into savings accounts and education funds. Daniel was a bright student and eventually he earned a place at a university in Columbus. I still remember the day I helped him move into his dorm room, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs while telling him how proud I was. During those years he called often, sometimes just to ask for advice about classes or to tell me about a new friend he had met. When he graduated and later found a steady job in sales, I believed the sacrifices had been worth it. Life moved forward quietly after that. Daniel married Rachel about 8 years ago, and they settled in a suburb outside Cleveland, about 110 miles from my house. At first our relationship remained warm. They visited during holidays and I drove up to see them whenever I could manage the 2-hour trip. But as time passed, I noticed small changes in Daniel that I tried not to think too much about. Our phone calls became shorter. Sometimes weeks would pass before he returned my messages. When we did speak, the conversations often drifted toward practical topics like money or work instead of the easy laughter we once shared. About a year ago, he began asking questions that seemed unusual at the time but harmless enough. He asked about my retirement plans, how many years I expected to keep working, and whether my company offered a pension after 30 years of service. I told him the truth that I planned to work at least a few more years because I enjoyed staying active and because I liked the routine of driving into the office each morning. I even remember laughing and telling him that I did not know what I would do with myself if I suddenly stopped working after so many decades. Daniel responded politely, but there was a brief pause in the conversation that I noticed even then. Standing in that banquet room now, surrounded by coworkers pretending not to stare, I realized that pause may have meant far more than I understood at the time. As I stood in the banquet room that evening trying to steady my breathing, Another memory slowly pushed its way to the surface, one that suddenly felt far more important than it had at the time. About 8 months earlier, Daniel had called me on a Sunday afternoon. I remember the exact moment because I had just finished mowing the small patch of grass behind my house, and I was sitting on the back steps with a glass of iced tea when the phone rang. His voice sounded friendly, almost unusually cheerful. He asked how work was going and whether I was still planning to stay at the company a few more years. I told him the same thing I had said before, that I liked staying busy and that the office still felt like a second home after 30 years. There was a pause on the line before he spoke again, and this time his tone was more careful. He asked if I had ever thought about retiring earlier than planned, maybe taking some time to travel or simply relax. I laughed softly when he said that because Daniel knew better than anyone that I was not the kind of person who could sit still for long. I told him I would probably become restless after 2 weeks without work. He did not argue, but I could tell the answer had not been what he hoped to hear. A few weeks later, he mentioned that he and Rachel might drive down to Toledo to visit. They arrived on a bright Saturday morning and stayed for lunch. Rachel was polite as always, though she spent most of the afternoon checking something on her phone while Daniel walked with me through the house asking casual questions. He asked about the mortgage, which had finally been paid off 3 years earlier, and about my retirement savings account. At the time, I believed he was simply being responsible, the way grown children sometimes worry about their parents getting older. I told him I had been careful with money my entire life, and that the company pension would help cover my living expenses whenever I did decide to retire. Daniel nodded thoughtfully while listening, and for a moment his expression was difficult to read. Later that afternoon, he said something that seemed harmless at the time but now echoed differently in my mind. He told me he was proud that I had worked so hard for so many years and that I deserved an easier life. I thanked him and told him every parent hopes their child grows up kind and thoughtful. What I did not realize then was that his visit had another purpose entirely. 2 weeks after that lunch, Daniel asked if he could stop by my office one day when he was passing through town for work. I agreed without hesitation because I was always happy to show him the place where I had spent most of my life. The office building stood about 10 miles from my house, a modest 2-story structure near the highway where delivery trucks came and went throughout the day. Daniel arrived around noon wearing a pressed shirt and carrying a friendly smile. I introduced him to several co-workers and he shook hands with everyone politely, including Mr. Harrison. They spoke for several minutes while I stepped away to answer a phone call from a client. At the time, nothing about the conversation seemed unusual. When I returned, Daniel simply said it was nice to finally meet the man who had been my boss for so many years. After that visit, he drove back toward Cleveland and life continued as normal, or at least that was what I believed until the moment my boss raised his glass tonight and revealed that something far more important must have been discussed during that quiet conversation. Standing in that banquet room, I slowly began to realize that the visit Daniel made to my office months earlier might not have been as simple as I believed. At the time, I thought he was just being a curious son who wanted to see where his mother spent her days, but now the memory played back in my mind with new meaning. I remembered the way he spoke with Mr. Harrison while I was across the room answering that phone call. Their conversation lasted longer than I realized at the time, nearly 10 minutes, and when I walked back toward them, both men suddenly shifted the topic to something casual about delivery schedules and highway construction near Cleveland. I had not questioned it then because nothing about the moment seemed suspicious. After all, Daniel had always been polite and respectful around my coworkers. But tonight, hearing my boss speak so casually about my son asking the company to let me go, that quiet conversation from months ago suddenly felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I had not known existed. I tried to recall everything that happened after Daniel left that day. At first, nothing appeared different. I continued arriving at the office every morning before 8 o'clock, parking in the same spot near the loading dock and greeting the same security guard who had worked the front desk for years. The routine remained familiar, yet looking back now I realized the atmosphere in the office had shifted slightly in ways that were easy to overlook at the time. My supervisor began asking more detailed questions about my workload, especially about how long certain projects took me to complete. The human resources manager stopped by my desk twice within 1 month just to ask how I was feeling about my job and whether I had thought about retirement plans. Those questions had seemed friendly and routine then, but now they felt like quiet evaluations that had already begun behind the scenes. 3 weeks ago, I was called into a small conference room near the accounting department where the human resources manager and Mr. Harrison were waiting with polite expressions. They explained that the company was adjusting its structure and that my role would soon be phased out. They assured me it had nothing to do with my performance and that the decision was simply part of modernizing the department. I accepted their explanation without argument because after 30 years I trusted the company and the people who worked there. They told me the transition would happen quickly, but that they wanted to celebrate my long career with a retirement gathering so everyone could say goodbye properly. I remember leaving that meeting with mixed emotions but also a strange sense of gratitude. I believed the company was honoring my dedication, even while closing one chapter of my life. Now, standing among the decorated tables and half-finished drinks in this banquet room, I realized the story I had accepted might never have been the truth at all. My eyes moved again toward the door where Daniel and Rachel had disappeared earlier in the evening. I could not understand why my son would involve himself in a decision about my job, especially without telling me. I felt no anger yet, only a heavy confusion settling quietly in my chest, because if Daniel had truly asked the company to end my career early, then there had to be a reason he had never shared with me, and in that moment I began to wonder what else might have been happening behind my back for months without me noticing. I remained standing near the edge of the banquet table while the conversations around me slowly returned to normal, but inside my mind everything felt different now, like a quiet curtain had been pulled back on a part of my life I had never questioned before. I set my glass down carefully and stepped a few feet away from the crowd, trying to gather my thoughts while watching the lake through the tall windows of the conference center. The dark water outside reflected the lights from the building, and for a moment the calm view almost helped steady my breathing. That was when I heard footsteps approach behind me and a familiar voice speak softly. It was Linda Parker, the coworker who had hugged me earlier in the evening. Linda had worked at the company nearly as long as I had, and over the years we had shared countless coffee breaks and long conversations about work, family, and everything in between. She stood beside me now with a worried expression that told me she had been debating whether to speak. "Margaret," she said quietly, "are you all right?" I nodded slowly, even though I was not sure if that answer was entirely true. I asked her if she knew anything about what Mr. Harrison had just said regarding Daniel. Linda hesitated for a moment before replying, and that small hesitation told me more than words ever could. She glanced back toward the tables where the rest of the staff were sitting and then lowered her voice. "I did not want you to hear it like that tonight," she said gently. "Most of us assumed you already knew." A cold feeling settled in my chest when she said those words. I turned toward her fully and asked what exactly everyone believed I knew. Linda sighed softly and leaned one shoulder against the window beside us. She explained that several months ago Daniel had contacted the company asking to speak with Mr. Harrison privately. According to what she heard from someone in administration, he explained that I had been working too hard for too many years and that I would never choose to retire on my own. He told them I was stubborn about responsibility, and that the best way to help me enjoy the rest of my life was to encourage an earlier retirement. Linda paused after saying this and studied my face carefully. I told her I had never had that conversation with my son, and that until tonight I believed the company simply needed to restructure the department. Linda looked genuinely surprised when I said that. She shook her head slowly and said she always assumed Daniel had talked to me before approaching the company. She explained that management seemed convinced they were helping me by giving me a graceful way to leave the job with a celebration instead of a difficult discussion about aging employees. As Linda spoke, the pieces of the story began sliding together in my mind with unsettling clarity. My son had visited the office months ago, spoken privately with my boss, and somehow convinced the company that ending my career early would be doing me a favor. I looked back across the banquet room again at the empty doorway where Daniel had disappeared earlier in the evening. The question that echoed quietly in my thoughts was not simply why he did it, but why he never told me himself. The quiet explanation Linda shared beside the window did not bring anger the way someone might expect, but instead it left me standing there with a deep and unsettled sense of disbelief, because the Daniel I remembered raising was never the kind of person who would make decisions about my life without speaking to me first. I thanked Linda softly for telling me the truth and assured her that I would be fine, even though the words felt heavier than usual leaving my mouth. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze before returning to the other tables where the rest of the staff were trying to continue the evening as if nothing unusual had happened. I remained by the window for another minute watching the reflections of the lights ripple across the surface of Lake Erie outside, letting the quiet settle in my thoughts. The more I considered what Linda said, the more a new question began to form in my mind, one that felt just as important as the first. If Daniel truly believed he was helping me by encouraging the company to end my career early, then why did he never once mention it during our phone calls or visits? The memory of our last conversation a few weeks ago replayed clearly. He had sounded normal, even cheerful, asking about the party and telling me he and Rachel would make the drive from Cleveland to celebrate with me. There was no hesitation in his voice, no hint that he had already spoken to my employer about my future. That realization created a quiet tension in my chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment from the speech earlier in the evening. Instead, it felt like the uneasy understanding that an important part of the story was still missing. I turned slowly and looked across the banquet room again. Most of my coworkers were seated at the round tables finishing slices of cake or chatting about weekend plans. A few people glanced toward me and then quickly looked away, as if they were unsure whether they should approach or give me space. Mr. Harrison stood near the podium speaking with two managers from accounting. His expression relaxed as though the evening had unfolded exactly as he expected. Yet the one person I needed to speak with most was no longer there. Daniel and Rachel had left the room quietly sometime after the speech, slipping out without saying goodbye. I walked toward the table where they had been sitting earlier and noticed that Daniel's glass of water was still half full beside an untouched napkin. The sight made something inside me tighten slightly, because it suggested they had not planned to stay very long after that moment. I stepped away from the table and took a slow breath while considering my next move. Driving home without understanding what had happened did not feel right. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contact list until Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For several seconds I simply stared at it while thinking about the little boy who used to ride his bicycle beside the Maumee River and wave proudly whenever he completed another lap around the park path. Then I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, hoping that somewhere on the road between Toledo and Cleveland my son would answer and finally explain the decision he made about my life without ever asking me first. I held the phone to my ear while the soft ringing sound echoed quietly through the line, and for a moment I wondered if Daniel would even answer. The banquet room behind me had grown louder again as people returned to their conversations, but the noise felt distant compared to the weight of the question sitting in my mind. After the third ring, the call finally connected and I heard Daniel's voice on the other end. He sounded slightly out of breath, as if he had just stepped outside or hurried somewhere quiet. He greeted me casually, asking if the party was going well, and that simple question made the silence on my side of the line stretch longer than usual. I stepped closer to the hallway outside the banquet room so my voice would not carry back into the crowd. I told him that Mr. Harrison had just given his speech and mentioned something surprising about Daniel asking the company to let me go earlier than planned. There was a short pause on the line after I said those words. It was not a long pause, perhaps only a few seconds, but it was enough for me to notice. When Daniel finally spoke again, his tone was calm, almost careful. He said he had only suggested the idea because he believed I deserved to enjoy life after working so hard for so many years. He explained that he did not want to see me spending the rest of my 60s sitting behind a desk when I could be relaxing or traveling. His explanation sounded thoughtful on the surface, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like a sentence he had practiced before. I asked him gently why he never mentioned any of this to me directly. Another brief silence followed before he answered that he did not want to upset me or make me feel pressured about retirement. According to him, he simply thought the company might find a way to ease me into the transition naturally. As he spoke, I leaned against the wall in the quiet hallway and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. Part of me wanted to believe his explanation completely because it would mean his actions came from concern rather than something else. Yet another part of my mind could not ignore the strange way the story unfolded. If Daniel truly believed he was helping me, why did he and Rachel leave the party immediately after the speech instead of staying to celebrate? Why did he sound surprised when I told him what Mr. Harrison had said, even though the conversation with the company must have happened months earlier? I opened my eyes again and looked down the hallway toward the exit doors leading to the parking lot. I asked Daniel one more question, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. I asked whether there was anything else I should know about the conversation he had with my boss. The line grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt heavier than before, as if my son was carefully deciding how much truth he wanted to share. When he finally answered, his voice was softer, and what he said next made me realize that the decision about my career might not have been the only plan he and Rachel had been discussing behind my back. For several seconds after I asked that question, the only sound on the phone was the faint noise of traffic somewhere near Daniel, the distant hum of cars passing on a highway, and I could almost picture him sitting in his car with one hand on the steering wheel while trying to decide what to say next. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, less confident than the careful explanation he had given earlier. He told me that he and Rachel had been talking about my future for a while, and that they both believed it would be better if I retired sooner rather than later. At first those words sounded almost reasonable, but then he continued speaking and the real meaning behind their plan slowly became clear. Daniel explained that he and Rachel had recently been trying to start a small business together, something involving online sales and product distribution. He said the first few months had been more difficult than they expected, and that they were under a lot of financial pressure while trying to get everything running. I listened quietly without interrupting because I already sensed where the conversation might be heading. Daniel went on to say that when he started thinking about how long I had worked and how responsible I had always been with money, he believed early retirement might allow me to help them temporarily while they stabilized their business. The hallway outside the banquet room suddenly felt colder as those words settled in my mind. I asked him gently what exactly he meant by helping them. He answered with another pause before explaining that if I retired earlier than planned, I would begin receiving my pension sooner, and might also consider using some of my savings to support their business until it became profitable. His tone suggested that he viewed the idea as a simple family arrangement, something natural between parents and children. Yet hearing the plan described so casually left a quiet ache forming in my chest. I thought about the decades I spent working overtime shifts, the careful budgeting that allowed me to pay off my house and build those savings slowly over many years. None of those decisions had ever been about future business investments. They had been about stability, about making sure my son grew up safe and secure. I asked Daniel one more question before the conversation could drift further. I asked whether he truly believed arranging my early departure from work without telling me first was the right way to begin asking for that kind of help. The line fell silent again for a long moment. When he answered, his voice sounded uncertain for the first time that evening. He said he thought I might refuse if he asked directly, and that he only wanted to create an opportunity where I could finally relax while also helping the family move forward. I stood there in the quiet hallway listening to those words while the celebration continued behind the banquet doors, and in that moment I understood something that felt both painful and strangely clarifying. My son had not tried to end my career because he believed I deserved rest. He had done it because he believed my future income and savings would be easier to access if my working life ended sooner than I had planned. Thank you for enjoyed.